So, in my opinion, at this point, I think it's been pretty sufficiently demonstrated that it's very difficult to critique taxation and redistribution in virtue of the merits of these kinds of policies. Any level of serious engagement with the empirical literature will tell you that welfare, when done right, is a very efficient way of substantially alleviating poverty, substantially alleviating income inequality, even spurring economic growth and productivity and innovation and business startups, giving people more sort of control over their own lives, et cetera, et cetera. And so the only option that's really left for opponents of redistribution is to critique these policies in virtue of there being, some form of theft or coercion or violence. And you see this move made all the time by libertarians and conservatives who often like to opportunistically masquerade as libertarians and so on, where people like Ben Shapiro will get up on stage and they'll say, guys, we can't do redistribution because that's theft and theft is wrong. You're pointing a gun to somebody's head and you're taking their money from them forcefully. And evidently, these kinds of intuition pumps and comparisons with theft are very forceful for a lot of people who maybe haven't thought about the issue as much. And so in this video, I kind of just wanted to break down why these sorts of appeals are so vacuous and misleading. So the central question I'm going to be addressing here is taxation theft? And in order to answer that question, we need a working definition of theft, obviously. So what are some potential definitions? Well, one potential definition we could use is theft occurs when you threaten or use force against somebody to exclude them from scarce material resources without their consent. That seems like a pretty neutral, not that controversial definition of theft. However, the problem is libertarians, in arguing that taxation is theft, can't actually use that definition. Because that definition would apply to all sorts of things that libertarians actually support. So take property ownership, for example. What is property ownership if not me saying, I'm going to exclude everyone else in the world from this material resource by claiming ownership of it without the consent of everyone else whose prior access to this resource I have now eliminated. And in addition, I'm going to threaten force against anybody who doesn't comply with this arrangement. And so if libertarians want to defend property ownership, they can't actually use that definition of theft. Additionally, if somebody stole my car and I went and I stole that car from the person who stole my car, I took it back. Clearly, libertarians wouldn't want to say that this is theft or that this is wrong. And by the way, as a quick semantic point, when I'm saying libertarians, I'm just broadly talking about economic libertarians. So this would include types like Ben Shapiro, who kind of pretend to be libertarians. So clearly, a libertarian can't actually use that definition when trying to define theft, right? And so inevitably, once this is pointed out, a libertarian has to add a new element to their definition of theft. And the new altered definition of theft would go something like this. Theft occurs when you threaten or use force against someone to exclude them from scarce material resources without their consent, provided that the scarce material resource belongs to them. And under this new definition, unconsensually and forcefully excluding someone from a resource is only bad if the resource belongs to that person. Now, the next question we have to ask is, well, what does that mean? What does it mean for a resource to belong to somebody? Well, clearly, a libertarian can't mean that it legally belongs to them, because if they were referring to legality, then taxation couldn't be theft because taxation is completely legal. And clearly, they can't be talking about something belongs to me if I'm currently in possession of it, because then if I steal somebody's car and they come and take their car back from me, that would be theft on their part because I'm currently in possession of the car. So when a libertarian says that the resource belongs to somebody, what they're referring to is some concept of that person having a moral entitlement to that resource. So, under the new definition of theft, right, it is this aspect of moral entitlement that is actually doing all of the argumentative work. So, the initial opposition to force and violence becomes just completely irrelevant because libertarians aren't actually opposed to those things unless they're also violating the moral entitlement aspect. So, the point here is that while libertarians frame it as if they have a principled moral opposition to violence and coercion, all they're really opposing at the end of the day is property arrangements which contradict the libertarian theory of who's entitled to what property. The problem, however, is that people disagree about who's entitled to what property. So, for example, think about a policy which would tax the wealthy to pay for healthcare for poor people. Let's think about Medicare for all or something. Would this policy be theft? Again, the definition of theft that we're using is threatening or using force against someone to exclude them from a scarce material resource without their consent, provided that they are morally entitled to the resource. So surely a supporter of Medicare for all and an opponent of Medicare for all would both agree that such a policy would be forcefully excluding rich people of resources without their consent. But the point here is that neither party in this argument necessarily opposes any of those things. The disagreement then purely lies in whether the rich people in this case are morally entitled to the resource that we're talking about taking. So if rich people are entitled to the money, then it's theft. If the poor people have more of a moral entitlement to the money that would be used to fund their healthcare, then it's not theft. So the point here is that while libertarians and conservatives try to frame the taxation debate as people who support violent coercion versus people who oppose violent coercion, in reality, what we have is two groups of people, both of whom support violence and coercion to uphold systems of property entitlement, but who disagree about what that system should look like. So, to reiterate, the disagreement between opponents and supporters of taxation has nothing to do with a disagreement about to what extent violence and coercion is permissible. It has everything to do with conflicting moral theories of property entitlement. So, the main point here is that the argument that taxation is wrong because it's theft begs the question by assuming the correctness of a particular theory of property entitlement. So saying taxation is wrong because it's theft is virtually the same as saying taxation is wrong because taxation is wrong, because the word theft smuggles in a certain moral conclusions about the act that we're talking about. It's sort of similar to when an opponent of abortion says abortion is wrong because abortion is murder. Well, again, that's just going to be question begging because the word murder implicitly assumes that the act is wrong. And so the same thing is going to be true with the definition of theft. So now that we've established a few things. We've established that the appeals and the intuition pumps with regards to violence and coercion are completely misleading. We've established that the argument that taxation is theft is wrong because it's theft is a question-begging argument, and that the real disagreement is just going to come down to conflicting moral theories of property entitlement. The next question to ask is, okay, well, what is the moral theory of property entitlement that is being used by people who oppose redistribution? And it seems pretty clear that all somebody is saying, the moral theory of property that somebody is employing when they're opposing redistribution is just the theory that says people are morally entitled to whatever property they acquire through market transactions, right? And so the question about whether or not taxation is theft is ultimately just going to come down to, is that a good, morally acceptable theory of who should be entitled to what property? Now, I would say that the answer is pretty clearly no. I don't think it makes sense to say that people should be morally entitled to whatever property they earn through free market mechanisms. And the main reason for that is this. A free market distributes national income based solely on the marginal productivity of each unit of capital and labor. The problem with this is about half of the population neither works nor owns a considerable amount of capital, meaning their true factor income is zero. So if we break down that category of people who aren't earning any market income because they're not working, this isn't just like people who are lazy and are choosing not to work, right? The category of non-workers is by and large made up of a few different groups of people. Elderly people, children, disabled people, caretakers, so like people who are busy taking care of a sick family member, and students. And unemployed people, but that's the smallest category by far. But mostly it's like old people and children and disabled people. And so a moral theory which says that the most moral way for wealth to be distributed is on the basis of free market transaction is a moral theory of property entitlement which says that 50% of this 50% of the population in a given society should just be doomed to poverty unless they're able to effectively beg enough at the doorsteps of the other 50% of society in order to make some amount of money, enough to barely subsist through charity. Now, the problem is that, the first problem with this is that charity doesn't even really work. So I can link OEC data in the description, but basically when you look at the correlation between net public social spending, i.e. welfare, and poverty reduction, the R-squared correlation is about 0.64, which is obviously very substantial. And when you look at the correlation between net private social spending, i.e. charity, and poverty reduction, the correlation is approximately 0.00. So charity just empirically seems to have zero effect on the rate of poverty. And so unless we think it's morally acceptable to have massive swaths of the population being doomed to poverty, and not for any factors that are their fault even. It's not somebody's fault that they're old or a child or disabled. We're effectively saying, what the libertarian is effectively saying, or the opponent of redistribution, is that it is morally acceptable for people to be doomed to poverty in virtue of factors that they had no control over. Personally, I would find that morally abhorrent. And if you similarly find that morally abhorrent, then the argument that taxation is theft should just have no force to you. because, yeah. Um, yeah, so that's all I really wanted to say about that. Um, Obligatory shout out to my $10 patrons, that being Zool, Eduardo Squidwardo, Raven, Zero, SJEW Nelson, Alex Manzoni, Alexander Adams, Liam Offer, Isocratic, Benny G, Eric Varghese, and Eloy Points. Thank you. I appreciate it to everybody who supports me, both my $10 patrons and my $5 patrons. If you're interested in supporting me, I'll link my Patreon in the description. I occasionally write articles about the same sorts of topics that I talk about on this channel. So I guess if you appreciate what I do on this channel, you're liable to also appreciate what I do on my Patreon page. So check that out if you're interested. Otherwise, thanks for watching.